Alright guys, welcome back to the shop. So I am in a very good mood this morning and I am ready to jump into building the headboard and footboard. So we're going to try and get most of it done today. We're not going to be getting onto the glue up today because we still want to keep all these parts separate. That way we can do our final fit up on the side rails before we have all the headboard and footboard together. But what I want to try to accomplish today is just getting all of the components, all the joinery and all that cut and milled down so that we can actually put this stuff together when it comes time to. Because we are hopefully in the home stretch. I'm hoping that over this next week, we can actually finish off this bed. A bed frame like this shouldn't take very long. It should only be about maybe a 2-week project, and that's with a decent amount of resting periods in there for stuff like epoxy or the milling process and that. The other reason I'm in a really good mood today is because yesterday I received the first samples of the hoodie and the sweatshirt. So you guys have been asking about these. You know, when I announced the rest of the merch, I got quite a few questions about when this stuff will actually be launched, because some of you guys wanted to wait and save your orders till this stuff was launched as well. So it is now going to be launched on Saturday. Right now I only have this hoodie, and then I also have the high detail logo design. Then the sweatshirt I only have the badge. Now this is going to be changing because after receiving these, I absolutely love them. I don't want to make too much of this video an ad about my new merch, but this stuff is so much more comfortable than I was expecting. If you follow me on Instagram, you heard me talk about my merch and how it's completely changed my mindset about buying clothing because it's genuinely comfortable, good clothing that I can actually wear in the shop. I've stuck to wearing basically the same outfit for years now because it was just what I found comfortable. Now I get to at least change it up a little bit. I got some nice comfortable hoodie, I got a sweatshirt, and I'm going to continue to be ordering a lot of my own merch just because I find it so comfortable and just so much more exciting to wear because it's got some pretty sweet designs on it. So if you guys are interested in a hoodie, a sweatshirt, or a t-shirt, feel free to go check out the website. There will be a link either at the end of the video or in the description of this video. You can go check that out. But anyway, let's move right along with the video because today is going to be fun time making a whole bunch of sawdust. So right now, most of our pieces have been resting for about, I want to say almost a week now because I think we milled them back on Monday. They've been sitting here for a good long time. They're kind of under the weight of the big side rails. I've been kind of using this stack of lumber as a little bit of a table for the past week. So it's worked out quite nicely. It's quite nice to have another surface back here. But anyway, what we need to do is we need to move the side rails somewhere else so I can actually get access to this whole stack. And we're going to first run through and mill up all this lumber. But the very first thing we have to check, and the thing that I am absolutely the most worried about, is our little epoxy patch on that knot. I don't know if it's hardened up yet. The last time I checked it, which was a couple days ago, it was still quite squishy. So I'm very worried to see what's going to happen with that patch. Okay, so the epoxy it's getting there. It's definitely better than it was when I checked it a few days ago, but we still have a decent amount of squish to it. Like I can still move it around, it's still malleable. So that 24-hour epoxy is definitely the issue. The deep pour stuff that I used at first, it's all fully hardened up on the edges here and on the bottom area where you can definitely feel a difference between where we put that 24-hour epoxy in and that deep pour stuff. So I think that 24-hour epoxy that I went to was a horrible life choice. I should have just finished it off with the deep pour stuff. But anyway, this board is not going to work for what we need. It might harden up eventually, then I might be able to still make use of this whole section of walnut here. Overall, it's still a pretty nice board, so we will be able to use it for something else in the future, but it's not going to make it into this project because I kind of need to get the work done, and this is not going to harden up in time. So I'm going to make a quick trip down to the lumberyard, get a new board to replace this one, and then we'll be right back, hopefully. All right, so back with that brand new board, and I know what a lot of you guys are probably thinking, you can't go through and mill this board right now because you have to let it rest, you have to worry about wood movement, all that kind of stuff. And that is very true. Ideally, if you can let your boards rest in that, when you first bring them back to your shop, that's a pretty good thing to do. Now, the truth is that it's not really a necessary step for a lot of woodwork, especially for me, because my shop is in a garage and I open that garage door, 2 to 3 times a day. The climate in the shop is the exact same as the climate in Calgary. Then the place that I buy my lumber from is basically the exact same thing. It's a warehouse where the stuff is stored indoors, so in a pseudo-heated environment, but they also generally have their doors open. And so the climate indoors there is basically the exact same as the rest of Calgary. So overall, this wood has been stored in the same climate as my shop for a few months now. If I was doing this in the winter, it would be a completely different story, because in the winter I keep the shop I keep the heat on, so it's a much warmer climate in here. It's much less humidity because there's not a whole bunch of moisture in here where there is outside. So in the winter, it would be a completely different story. But in the summer, the climate everywhere else in the city is basically the same as in the shop here. Where you do want to be careful of this is a lot of places in the US and even Eastern Canada where it's very humid. I know that a lot of people have a dehumidifier in their shop to help take out some of the moisture in the air. If you live in a humid climate and you have a dehumidifier in your shop climate is going to be very, very different compared to where you buy your wood from. So in that case, you do want to let your wood acclimate to the shop. But again, for my purposes here, I'm in a pretty good rush with this project. I need to get it done hopefully by the end of this coming week. And the climate of my shop is the exact same as the climate where this thing has been living for the past few months. Anyway, there's not really gonna be anything to talk about with this board, so we're just going to get it milled down so it matches that one we already had. And then once we have it matching that, then we'll actually start running through getting all of our pieces together, doing our final milling process and all that. So it's gonna be, we're gonna just kind of power through this because I wanna just kind of get through this initial milling phase and get on to the joinery side of things. All right, so we now have all of our boards milled to their final width, thickness, all that. Last thing we need to do is cut them to length. But two things I want to mention about that milling process. When I was passing these longer pieces, the ones that we had initially when I passed them over the jointer, you could tell that the jointer was only making a very, very light cut. And I was only taking off maybe a 64th of an inch cut on the jointer. So these boards have stayed perfectly flat for that whole week that they were sitting there. So that just goes to show that the board that I went and picked up today and we fully milled, it's not gonna have any issues as we go through this because those 3 boards that we did a week ago, they haven't moved whatsoever in that whole week that they've just been sitting there. So that new fresh one should be just fine. So the second thing with these boards is when we initially milled them, I talked about there's 2 different ways we could go about getting them down to width. Now, obviously you guys saw me use the table saw here, and the only reason initially I was kind of hesitant to use the table saw is because of the whole back end of the piece. So when you're trying to feed this into the blade, in this back end, there's a lot of leverage back there. So if I twitched my arm, there's a good chance I could send this piece right into the blade and it could come flying back at my face. So not a very good option. So the one thing you want to watch out for when you're bringing the board up to the blade is when you first put it down on the table, it's going to be rocking around a little bit. You're going to get a lot of that wag to it. So you just want to stand there for a couple seconds, just hold it, wait till it stops wagging, then start feeding it through. That's probably one of the most important things anytime you're putting a long board through a table saw or pretty much any machinery is you have to watch out for that back end because there is so much leverage that can happen back here that it can cause issues to happen real quick. The other way I talked about getting these down to width was putting them vertically through the planer. So we put them through the planer just like that. And there's not really an issue with it, but what could go wrong terrifies me. With the table saw, I know that my only real risk is kickback. So I have to do everything in my power to make sure that the front end of the board, the part that's already passed through the blade, doesn't come in contact with the backside of that blade. So I can keep my hands nice and steady. I can make sure I have the riving knife installed in properly. There are things I can do to actively prevent that. Whereas with the planer, as I'm passing this piece through the planer, it is now completely out of my control. The machine has full control over the feed speed, all that kind of stuff. So if the machine decides to twist that board, again, I don't even know what would happen if that board was to twist inside of the planer. I don't know what the planer would do. I don't know what chaos particularly would happen, and it's not something I really wanted to find out. So I found plenty of sources of people saying that, you know, if you have 8-quarter stock like this and you need to get a whole bunch of pieces down to an accurate width, you can use your planer. It's perfectly safe. But again, for me, it's that unknown aspect. I don't know what would happen if something went terribly wrong. Again, the table saw just overall seemed like the better option. So those are just a couple quick points to mention about milling these long boards. These are big boards and you gotta be very careful with just how you deal with them in the shop, because again, leverage is everything, and with these boards you have a lot of leverage to worry about. So now that we have our pieces all milled up, we can actually start laying things out and figuring out where we want things to go. So we already know from our initial, when we were laying out our components, that these two pieces are for our headboard because they're just a slight bit taller. Then these two are for our footboard. Now these ones, definitely we didn't lose a whole lot of the sapwood in them, but I'm really excited to put these in the footboard, even though they have a decent amount of sapwood down the edges, because they're going to look super cool. There's a ton of figure to them. There's a pretty good knot section at the bottom, so we're going to have a figure at the bottom. I think the sapwood is going to blend in nicely and just add a little bit of a highlighted point to the footboard. So that's going to be a nice, cool touch. Then for our headboard, we have those pieces already figured out. So we're going to start by pulling all of our long stretchers onto here and just figuring out which is the nicest side. So then we're going to put that face up on the workbench, and we're just going to kind of keep working from there. So because all of our long stretchers are completely interchangeable, now we just have to pick out which ones are going to look best where. So again, we already know we're going to have some sapwood visible on the footboard, so we may or may not lean in or shy away from that. I know that on the top of the footboard, the part that's going to be very visible, I want to have that solid heartwood. So I've got a couple different options here. This board, solid heartwood on the edges. We've got a decent amount of sapwood on the back side here, and then on the front side, we just have a little touch of it. So that might be a good option for the footboard. Our next one here, we've got a big visible knot right here, which I don't really love. A little bit of sapwood, but mainly this knot is going to be kind of gnarly. So this one is going to be a good bottom stretcher for either the headboard or the footboard, because the front side of it has a nice knot that has a little bit of cracking that we're going to have to fill. But overall, there should get some good figure around it. So if that's the bottom board on either the headboard or the footboard, it's going to look just fine. Our next board here is very similar to the first. We've got one edge here, has a decent amount of sapwood on it, a little bit poking through right on one edge, and then the back side, again, has a decent amount of sapwood. So I'm just going to stack that on the front one here, because these two also have very similar colors to them. Again, when you're working with walnut, you have to be kind of conscious of what the color choices you are working with are. These two also blend well with the boards that we already have picked out for the footboard, so we may end up going that route. Then our last board here has a whole bunch of figure to it, looks pretty clean all the way through. We do have a small defect where we just didn't hit it with when we were cutting out the table saw, so that means there's just a little bit of a dip in there that we'll have to clean up with the hand plane. But overall, I don't think there will be much issue with the way that this board is. It's got a little bit of sapwood on the back, a little bit of sapwood on that edge, but overall it's a very clean board and just looks pretty dang good. So the only trick here is I've got two boards that I don't like the position of things in them. And so the way that we're gonna go about doing this now is we're gonna put this board that's got this big knot on the edge here, we're gonna put this as the top stretcher on our headboard, even though that goes against what I just said with it. Because what we can do is when we cut the grooves that's gonna hold our floating panels and our tenons and all that, we'll cut right through that knot and hide most of it. So it's not gonna be that big of a deal. Plus this board looks nice and clean. We've got that little knot in the middle there. But our other choice for the top stretcher for the headboard is this one here. And this one, we've got a big knot on one side. It's got a lot of figure to it. It's a beautiful board, but it's kind of lopsided on visual interest. This side back here is really straight grain all the way through. Then this side has really crazy grain. So it's gonna be very distracting and gonna make the headboard seem a little bit lopsided. So we wanna put that on the bottom of the headboard preferably. So then for our two boards that are gonna be for the footboard, we're gonna kind of mirror each other. Because we have sapwood on this end, no sapwood on this end. So if we put them in the orientation that I've got them laid in right now, we should kind of have a nice flow to them. I think these actually came from the same board. I don't quite remember, to be honest. So they do have very similar color, very similar grain structure. And when we bring in our actual footboard pieces and put them in a rough orientation, I think, something like that, they do blend really nicely together. And so now that we have to cut these boards to length, we obviously need to go back to using the circular saw, and we're gonna have the exact same issue that we've had on every other time we tried to use a circular saw here. But I did get a comment from a gentleman named Greg, and I think it's absolutely genius. So you guys have heard me mention his name before. He commented on a video, I think at the beginning of when I started doing the daily uploads. I can't remember what it was now, but it was, I remember it being helpful. So Greg, thank you again for your help. But what he mentioned is that when you're using a saw blade, like a circular saw here, because that blade is so thin, you're always gonna get deflection. No matter how small of a cut you're making, you're always gonna get deflection. So what I was doing is I would remove a big chunk of the material. So I'd remove the majority of the material that we need to get rid of. Then I would finish it up with a half pass, only using half of the blade to remove material. The problem with that, as Greg pointed out, is that the teeth orientation on these saw blades is meant to keep them tracking straight when both sets of teeth are fully engaged. So when you're only making a half cut, these are ATB teeth, which means they point to the left and they point to the right. So if only half of the teeth on this blade, and this is only a 24 tooth blade, so if only 12 teeth are actually doing our guiding, obviously that's going to add some deflection to the blade. So it makes complete sense. So what Greg suggested is rather than doing a big cut and then a half cut, just do multiple depth cuts. And I agree with him exactly. I think that is going to be the solution here. We just have to make a couple passes at different depths, and that should keep the teeth on both sides of the blade biting into solid wood. That way, when we actually cut through, the blade shouldn't deflect as much. So I'm gonna hope that this works. If it doesn't, we're gonna have to find another solution. Luckily, these boards are not nearly as big as those side rails, so we should be in a bit of a better situation to, kind of manipulate them in that. Okay, so I think that idea is gonna work. The one issue I had is when I had the saw and I was doing the first cut that was pretty shallow, it was only about a third of the way through the board. It was the saw was so tippy, it just wanted to tip over, just because your center of balance is so far off the board here. When you have the blade all the way down, the center of gravity of the saw is basically right on the base, so it gives you a little bit more balance. So basically what I have here is exactly the same cut I was getting when I was just kind of doing one pass with it. So we are nice and square across the width here, so that's a definite improvement. Maybe I'm just using the guide a little bit better. Maybe these boards are actually square and all that. There's all kinds of things. But we are square in this direction, which is good. In this direction, we are actually better, but definitely my first pass is all wobbly and wonky. So what I'm gonna try and do is I'm gonna try and do a very shallow pass. It's probably gonna screw things up more. We're gonna be cutting tenons into these anyway, so I'm not super concerned about it, but I do want to try and find a solution to this whole stupid circular saw issue. But again, doing it in those multiple depths definitely made a difference because we do have a square edge there. And the only reason we're not square on the vertical is because I screwed up and was wobbling my hand on the saw as we were making that cut. So this first board is now cut to a nice perfect length of 75 inches. We got both corners lining up on 75, which is how we know it's pretty good. It's good enough for what we need. Again, not everything in woodworking is about absolute perfection and machined surfaces and all that. That's the whole point of hand tools, is that we can adjust this stuff later on. But having it at that 75 length is perfect. So this is slightly longer than I had in my plans. What I was gonna do initially was just cut a 1-inch tenon on each side, but we had that excess material on there that there's no point throwing away walnut. You might as well turn that into joinery. So we're gonna be doing 1¼ inch long tenons. Again, it's just purely because I don't wanna throw away too much wood. Okay, so are they all perfectly squared up on the ends? The best, most perfectly milled board you've ever seen? No. But are they all 75 inches in length? Yes. Or close enough to that 75 that we can work with them. So again, this is one of the biggest things I want to get across to you guys because it is such an annoying thing here on YouTube is every woodworker seems like they're precision milling things. You know, we need our piece to be 4 inches wide, 1 3/4 of an inch thick, and 75 inches long. It needs to be perfectly sized, otherwise the whole project is screwed. That's a very common theme you'll see here on YouTube. Whereas I can tell you guys that this board is close enough to 75 inches. We're, you know, maybe a 64th or a 32nd of an inch under 4 inches wide. And for thickness, we're just a hair under 1 3/4. So again, nothing here is perfect, but that doesn't matter because that's the beauty of woodworking. It's not like machining things where we need everything to come out perfectly. All you need is a piece of wood that has mostly square sides, all that. Perfection is a nice thing to have, but again, it's way more important as a woodworker to know how to work with the wood that you have rather than trying to machine it perfectly every single time. So if you're too obsessed with getting stuff perfect, you're never gonna get anything done in the shop. You're way better to smash out, 10 different projects, all of them maybe not being absolutely perfect with, dimensions and that, but you're better to do those 10 projects rather than spending too much time, money, and effort on that one single project that you're just obsessing about getting the perfect pieces out of. So now what we need to do is add some grooves in here to hold our floating panels, and that we'll use as a basis for cutting our mortises for all these tenons we need later on. And we're going to be cutting grooves in quite literally all of our pieces. So we're going to be doing the grooves at the same time in these pieces, in all of our long stretchers, as well as our leg stock. And we're going to be doing all of it with the router, this really dusty guy right here that's been sitting by the table saw when I was ripping all this stuff down. So it is absolutely covered in dust. And so we're going to be using this mortising jig that I talked about when we cut the mortises into the legs. So basically all it is just a piece of acrylic with some white oak sliders on it that we can use to then dial in where we want the router to sit. So what we need here is we need a groove that's going to run down the center of the board, and we're going to be centering it because it's the easiest way to do it, on basically all sides of these shorter divider pieces, on the inside faces of our long stretchers, and then on the, on specific areas on our leg pieces. So anywhere we're going to have those floating panels sitting, we need to have that groove in there. So before we start cutting everything down to length, cutting joinery and all that kind of stuff, we want to cut the groove. Because I've mentioned this in almost every project I've done recently, if you're going to have grooves in your pieces of wood like we're going to do it here, cut it before you ever cut your joinery and your tenons. Because what inevitably happens to me is if I cut my tenons and then I fit them to my mortises, then I go back and cut my groove. Every single time I have done that, I always end up cutting the groove and cutting out part of my tenon, and then I have a loose fit that's going to be an issue. Whereas here, I want to avoid that. So always, always, always cut the groove first. It'll make your life a lot easier. But I just caught myself because we can't actually cut the groove yet because we need to make sure we're actually sizing our groove to a specific thing. So I'm not saying a specific size, a specific thing. So we have our white oak panels that have been sitting on a nice flat surface with some weight on them for about a week now. And so what we need to make sure of is that we have all of these panels nicely or evenly thicknessed around them before we actually cut this groove, because the thickness of these panels is going to change slightly when we go through and put them through the drum sander to clean them up here, because we still have some of those glue up lines, some of the marks from the glue up and all that in them, and we want to make sure that we take that stuff out before we try and fit these into a groove. When y'all hear me say I hate this machine, this is exactly why. It does not hold the sandpaper in there firmly enough. Then what happens is it loses grip on one side, so then this piece overlaps with the other areas and then causes these nasty burning marks. That's what it does to the panel, and that is going to take me a lot of time to try and get that stupid burn marks out. So even though this machine is about as good as it gets for a small drum sander for a garage shop, this thing sucks. Okay, so our panels are flat enough. I say flat enough because One of the downsides to an open-end drum sander is that no matter what any company tries to sell you on, that open end is always going to lift up. You can visibly see it in a lot of the videos that I posted in the past. You can see that open end just lift up just slightly. So you're never going to get a perfectly flat panel when you're doing that, but they are flat enough. And I took them up to 150 grit on the front side, just left them at 80 grit on the back side because we'll deal with all that when we actually get to fitting them up. But just to preempt some of the questions, I said that I absolutely hate that machine. I do. I love it, but I hate it. You might be wondering, why don't I sell it and get something better? Well, for one, any other drum sander that you can buy on the market that is better than that one runs on a 220 volt circuit. I physically cannot get a 220 volt circuit into the garage here, just due to the service amperage of the lot that we're on here. We can't bring that 220 volt circuit in here. I've looked into it. I've talked to electricians. It's not possible, which really sucks, but it's one of those things I have to deal with. So as far as 110 volt drum sanders go, that is as good as it gets. The only other ones that are available here in Calgary are CraftX, which you guys know my opinion of CraftX, and King Canada, which is another one of those brands that is not a good brand. So realistically, that drum sander is just the best of a worst case scenario. Basically, everywhere I've looked on the market for a 110 volt circuit, you can't really get a good drum sander. And so it is a decent little drum sander, but it just has a lot of little issues with it. That, again, a machine that is $2,000, $2,000, that is a big number. A machine that is that expensive should not have as many issues as this machine does. So it's a decent little drum sander, but at that price point, you're just paying a little too much for the amount of maintenance and caring it takes to do it. Anyway, we now have a fairly consistent thickness all through our panels here. Again, not great because of the open-end drum sander. You're much better if you have like a wide planer or a wide belt sander or a wider drum sander. But this is as good as I can get them. So we're going to base our groove off of just kind of the edge width here, because I know that my edge widths are fairly consistent throughout the panels. I know the panels are just a little bit under 5/8 of an inch. So that means that with our 1/2 inch bit in the router here, we're going to be making 2 passes, which works out perfectly because it means that we'll get a perfectly centered groove on all of our walnut pieces. So we'll make 1 pass with the router, flip the board around, make another pass. So it should be a fairly easy and safe operation. So you can see the kind of fit we're going for here on this first pass. We have a very, very tight fit. So this is tighter than I would like to have the panel sitting in here, just because it doesn't allow for any wood movement or growth and expansion of the wood and its thickness. And so this groove size is perfect because when we go through and sand these panels with that 220 grit finish sanding, they will then perfectly fit into the groove that we're going to cut into all of these boards. Alright, so we've got all of our headboard and footboard pieces. We've got the groove cut into one side of the longer stretchers and then both sides of our divider pieces. Now you might be wondering why I'm not using a dado stack here, and it's purely because of safety concerns. With those long stretchers, I was fine cutting them on the table saw, cutting them to width on the table saw, but cutting them with the dado stack is just a little bit risky because the dado stack doesn't have a riving knife or anything like that to help prevent kickback. It's just kind of a more risky operation, so I didn't want to do it. I probably could have done it, but it's also just as easy to do with the router. Only downside to the router is that we obviously get all kinds of this horribleness everywhere, which again, dust mask, all that stuff is on. But the benefit of this is that when we get over to our leg stock, which is what we're gonna do next, we can do a stopped groove. So normally when I need to add a groove like this to leg stock, I'll just cut it all the way through and then put a little filler piece on the bottom. But because here we have the option with the router to not do a groove all the way through and have to make that filler piece and all that, we're gonna do it. Okay, so that is all the materials for the headboard and the footboard. It really doesn't seem that much. When you think about a king-size bed, they seem massive. You know, it seems like such an overwhelming project. But I mean, when you look at it here, that's not that many components into actually making these things. So, I mean, I've been saying it from the beginning of the project. This is not a complex project. The only thing that makes it challenging is just the sheer scale of things. I mean, given that that is a divider and it is basically the same height as my chest, that is a big chunk of wood, and that's just a divider for the headboard. So I highly recommend that if you're thinking about making a bed frame, anything like that, you jump into it because it's an interesting challenge. Working with a bed frame really makes your brain think in ways you don't normally think. Just because everything is bigger, you have to think a lot more about the safety concerns and that of dealing with these large pieces. And as we saw with the side rails, milling them can be completely different than milling any normal board in your shop. So it's one of those things where you can really challenge yourself and try and jump in and just do stuff that, you know, you might never think to do. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in giving it a shot. Yeah, overall, pretty good time. But guys, that is going to do it for today. So tomorrow when we come back into the shop, we're going to start working on the actual joinery of this, starting to put everything together. So we're going to do all the mortise and tenon joinery on our long stretchers. Then once we have that together, we can start fitting up the dividers. And then finally, we'll get the panels all fitted together. We're not going to be doing a glue up tomorrow. I know that for sure because we still have a whole bunch of finishing work to do across all of these components before we can start putting stuff together. But it'll still be pretty exciting because by the end of tomorrow, we will be able to do a nice dry assembly of the entire bed frame here. So I'm really excited to see how this thing looks. So in case you guys forgot from the beginning of the video, the new hoodies and sweatshirts will be available on the website today. So make sure you go check those out if you're interested. But as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.